Thanks, that's great, Michael. Thank you for sharing Warframe with us. It looks fantastic. Want to get back to you in just a little bit here, but as Susan mentioned, my name is Andrew Giosa, and we have a great panel discussion about investments and a very diverse panel. So before we get started with some questions, I wanted to give an opportunity for our other panelists here. Hopefully we can get the noise turned down on the B-roll. So there's not explosions as I'm speaking. But just wanted to give them an opportunity to convey what their roles are and what the impact of investments in Ontario has meant to them, either personally by way of projects, their company, or on an aggregate level with some specific numbers, as well as just a brief overview of kind of the current state of things in their respective subsectors. So Jason, maybe you can lead us off.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the OMDC for having me here today, and for Andrew for moderating. My name is Jason Hilchey. I'm the president and CEO of the Entertainment Software Association of Canada. ESAC is the only national trade association in Canada that represents the video game industry. So we do a couple of things that, the two Ps. We protect and promote the industry. Under the protect, we advocate against policies that would be detrimental to the growth of our industry in Canada, such as advocating against government policies that could hurt our industry, but we also advocate for positive government policies that would make our industry stronger. Under the promotion side of things, we spend a lot of time developing research that's sector-specific to the video game industry, such as some of the statistics that I'll talk about today. And second of all, we take a lot of that information and we turn it into really, really interesting collateral that we use to promote the industry to policymakers, both provincially and federally, as well to the general public and the media.
That is not from the video game at all. It's some kind of external noise, sounds like moving or something, and we're just trying to sort out what that is and get it turned down. So just project and we'll get through it.
We'll stay in here while the apocalypse is outside.
Great. So Brian, maybe you can provide an introduction for yourself as well.
My name is Brian Top. I'm co-chair of Film Ontario, which is the trade association representing the film and television industry in Ontario. And among other things, I'm on the board of Pinewood Toronto Studios, the largest purpose-built studio in Toronto. And I too would like to say I thank the OMDC for inviting me to be on this panel and for bringing us all together to talk about these topics. And nothing is more exciting these days than talking about tax credits in the film and television industry. First thing I want to say is my wife would totally ban that game from our house. But it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I saw your face.
And the second thing I'd like to say very quickly is, one of the favorite people that I got to know when in the film and television business was this guy. I'll spare you his name, but he gave me a call after I started, but turned into a 12-year gig working at ACTRA. And he called me on the phone. He co-called me, and he had this grotesque New Jersey accent that was, right out of The Sopranos. And he wanted me to know that, to welcome me to the industry and to say he was looking forward to meeting with me, working with me. And he did this, I just want to call and let you know that I'm really glad that you're there. We're going to work together. And I thought, this is a friend of mine pulling my leg. And so I was just on the cusp of swearing at him when a little bit of caution came in, and I asked who was it calling, and it turned out that it was a senior vice president at one of the Hollywood studios. And so it was good that I didn't swear at him, but anyway, I spent some time talking to him over the years. Just a lot of people in the industry got to know this guy, and I remember once we were at lunch, and I was asking him to do something that he didn't want to do and that he thought was unreasonable, and he leaned across the table and said, I just want you to understand something. It's called show business, not show hobby. And it is a business, and it's an important business. It's a foundational business, increasingly, for the Canadian economy, and it's a good partner for government. And the creative industries in general, film and television in particular, are an interesting industry that does a lot of good for the Canadian economy and the sunshine part of the economy. tax credits that are invested in this industry are fully refunded to government, and so they finance themselves. It's some of the best economic development money that it is possible to spend in government. And it does do an intangible thing. It speaks to creating a village square for the country in which people can come together in the most compelling mediums, which are increasingly gaming, and talk to themselves about their values and their stories. And because we're Canadians, our jokes. And so I think as we feel our way into this topic, I think a good place to start is to say, this is public money well spent. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And Lucy?
All right. So I'm Lucie Lalumière. I'm a consultant in digital media, and I have about 15, 20 years of experience in the sector, depending what you count as being interactive digital media. I also advise and work on original IP projects. So I've been faced with the money challenge multiple times and continue to be faced with it. The other thing that engaged me quite a bit these days is being the vice chair of Interactive Ontario, which makes me talk to a lot of entrepreneurs about the tax credit and the grants and the other incentives that are in the market and that should be tweaked or added. I have to say, before I jump into the specifics, I want to tell you a bit about the IDM industry. In Ontario, it is a vibrant industry with over 17,000 employees, generating over $1 billion per year, and it's growing. It is growing because it's a business that is highly, I don't want to say dependent, but it's very much export focused, which means that the international markets are very lucrative for the business in IDM. So in that context, having grown the business over the last few years, the Ontario government has been instrumental in the growth of the industry. It has provided a competitive advantage to a lot of businesses. How? It has allowed companies to shift from work for hire to creating their own original IP via the IDM fund and the tax credit. It has allowed companies to hire local talent instead of outsourcing or partnering outside of Ontario via the tax credit again and the fund. And ultimately, it has allowed those companies to negotiate, find partners, promote their products via the export fund. So there's no doubt that the Ontario government has provided a competitive advantage to the industry up to now, and we're working very hard with them to make sure that the policies continue to evolve to meet the needs of the industry.
That's great, Lucy. Thank you so much. So I did want to jump back to Michael for a minute here and really shine some light on the tension that video game producers are feeling right now. I mean, there's a lot going on this year, evolving business models, next-gen consoles. There's an evolving role for publishers and aggregators. How does that impact Digital Extremes or any video game producer in Ontario?
Well, from our perspective at Digital Extremes, we're really excited to have the opportunity to have been able to make a game like Warframe and to look forward to the future where we can make our own original IP. We kind of started out that way in 1993. And the success of the industry kind of built on itself, and we really did become a franchise and hit-driven industry, at least in terms of the games that we were making and we wanted to make. And very quickly, the video game publisher started to take a stranglehold on a significant part of that business and taking it to the next level. And it left a lot of the game developers, the content producers, in a very precarious spot. Like I said, with the digital distribution proliferation increasing around the world, and Warframe has sold in more than 100 countries via digital distribution. You can only buy it online, and you can only buy stuff via the online store. So with these opportunities, we're taking on an increasingly important role in not only making our video game content, but also exploiting it. And I think that's a trend that all digital media producers are going to have to be a lot more conscious of. And then instead of taking all of your rights and handing it over to someone and hopefully they'll do proper by you, is that you can selectively choose who your partners are, who your distributors are, what channels you want to work through, and you can control your content, and you can be the one who collects the money and then dishes it out to other people rather than have them collect the money for you and you just get what's left over at the end.
So Michael, I think what you mentioned before of having historically a hit-driven industry is something that kind of resonates for everyone in this room, not just the video game sector. And what I wanted to talk about was something that we spoke about earlier, this idea of kind of having this continuum of how you're going to create your next title or your next project. And you kind of move between something that's totally self-indulgent and creative and something that you're passionate about, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, especially with kind of these free-to-play or new monetization models, where you're trying to create something for the pure economic viability. And you talked about the difficult decision of trying to land somewhere in between. I was wondering if you could provide some insight as to how investments themselves kind of help move that decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the things, because I've pitched over a number of years a lot of different game ideas to publishers and at certain points to investors, and I've showed the economic models, and quite often to get any sort of traction you'd have to say, oh, this is a video game that's it's kind of like Gears of War meets Uncharted meets this, so that you could give them an idea at least what you're talking about. Because when you're talking about a purely creative project, it's very difficult for them to get excited about it, to know if it's going to be any good, unless you can talk in terms of it's like other games or other things that have previously been successful. And that rhetoric seems to have kind of gone so deep in our industry that I think to have real creativity in the video game industry is become a real challenge, because you're struck between the possibility of doing anything at all, any sort of crazy thing, but no one will buy it and it's relevant to no one, versus something that's so highly copied and so highly derivative that making the game is just you've lost all that creativity, and it becomes just in some of the worst cases, video game development turns into this sweatshop. So you struggle between these two dichotomies, where you have to be market relevant, you have to have your own skin in the game, you have to be working towards critical and commercial goals. But on the other hand, there's some big funding hurdles in terms of getting investors involved, and that's where the OMDC and other funding companies or government agencies or other mechanisms can come in and help smooth that, especially for us when we're making big projects that traditionally would go for 2 years and just come to a hard stop, and then all of a sudden you'd have to pick up with something new. And aligning that those transitions were a big challenge, and that's where we saw a lot of big video game companies ultimately fail and disappear. And there are some in Ontario, certainly a lot in North America, North American video game industries that have done some amazing work that just couldn't transition from one project to another, get the financing lined up, and get everything ready to pick up after a big project is done. So it's a tough thing. Making video games is hard, but the business of video games has been even harder. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of emphasized that we're offering Warframe as a service. So unlike all the other games where you work like crazy for 2 years or 3 years sometimes, and then all of a sudden it's like you send it off to Microsoft or Sony to get certified, and it's like, oh, I'm done. like 3 years of work comes to a hard stop, and they're like, okay, we worked so hard, we've been putting in 80-hour weeks just to get it done. Now what do we do? You just don't have the time to plan for the next thing. And Warframe is much different in that it's a service. We hope that it will carry on for hopefully many years. Our plans are to support it for many years so that we can work in other projects in our company around that, rather than starting off with 10 or 15 developers at the beginning of a project, ramping up to 100, and then all of a sudden, what are those 100 people going to do as we start the next one? It's just a much better model, and I suspect from some of the discussions that I've had with other game developers in terms of the way they're developing not only games for PC or consoles, but also for mobile and portable, that they're taking a similar approach.
Right. So, Michael, you mentioned investors being one of your biggest hurdles. I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the difference that you have maybe when you're in front of an investor. Do they see your project or your game differently than the company? Like, is there a distinction? Is an investor looking to invest in a company or in a project?
Yeah, they're always looking at the project, and obviously if you're going to take a large amount of money and invest it in any sort of enterprise, you want to have some reasonable assurances that you're going to get it back. So the first thing that it seems to me that the first big check mark is, what's your idea? How are you going to market it? What platforms are you going to be on? And once you've got that part comfortable, that, hey, I've got a concept and an idea for a game, then you kind of move to the second and third most important questions, which would be, well, do you have the team? Or if you don't, are you going to hire the team? Do you have the technology? Do you have the expertise? Those are the next questions. But it's all, at least over the past generation of consoles, it's always been, it seems to me to have been about the project. And that's, again, that's another problem, because investing in projects is a very, very difficult thing for investors, yet our companies, our video game companies, are so project-oriented. Basically, we get paid either under contract to do a game, then it's done, it'll monetize, and then it's gone forever. And the next 2 years have to be about, okay, I've got a new contract for a new game, how well is that going to do? So as a company, you're always reinventing yourself. And even after, I mean, you're at a bit of an advantage when you come off your last game if it's a success, but if your last game was a failure, that's a very, very uphill battle to try and say, well, I learned from that, I won't make the same mistakes again, please give me $15 million to make a game.
So Brian, maybe you can step in here and give some perspective. Is this something similar that you would see in terms of stagnation, moving project to project, external investors looking to invest solely in a project rather than into a sustainable company on the film and TV side?
Well, it's a familiar issue in film and television, to be sure, and you know it well.
Yes.
You know, I mean, in the late 1990s and early aughts, a big part of the Ontario film and television business was service production aimed at producing projects for foreign, mostly American capital. Many of the companies that went down that route were doing them one at a time, and many of the same issues apply, right? It was you were betting the company every time you did a project. I think a lot of the experience that, since then shows that a more successful models, especially for Canadian domestic producers, is slate producers who get multiple projects going at once. Because another truism in the business, along with it's showbiz, it ain't show hobby, is nobody knows what works. It's impossible to say what's going to work, certainly in the film and television business. And so do lots of everything, throw it all at the wall, something will stick, maybe. And companies that go down that route have been building greater net value, they're more bankable, they're easier to invest in, they're what I think public sector investment should increasingly aim at creating.
Great, thank you. So I did want to jump back to gaming for a moment here, and I am a banker, so I am interested in the numbers. Jason, I was wondering if you could maybe provide some context as to video game sector's economic contributions within Canada, either GDP numbers or labor numbers, whatever you can provide to give us some context as to how big the industry is.
Yeah, absolutely. So every year, like I said, we do research. This year we did a large research project with Nordicity that aimed to kind of define the economic reach and impact of the video game industry in Canada. And so what we found was that we're at a point now where the video game industry alone in Canada represents $2.3 billion in GDP. Which is quite a large number, up from about 1.7 billion 2 years ago. So we've grown. The industry is growing across Canada to a point now where we employ almost 17,000 people. So it was about a 5% growth rate over the 2-year period, which is growing faster than the Canadian average job growth over that time. So our industry is healthy and growing. If not settling a little bit, but still growing at a healthy rate, a sustainable rate. So, we're talking about across Canada, 17,000 people with an average salary of close to $73,000 a year. So I think the average Canadian income is about $46,000. So we're talking, considerably higher than the average that our industry pays. So, and in addition to that, we're talking about an average demographic age of 31. So we're young, we're paying a lot of money, and we're contributing a great deal to the national GDP in Canada. In terms of just localizing that data here in Ontario, there's about 96, close to 100 video game companies in Ontario. There's about close to 350 video game companies in Canada. About 100 of them are here in Ontario. So Ontario represents a great deal of the percentage of the national number of studios. Those studios tend to be a little smaller, employing a small to medium-sized number of people, but there's still a great deal of studios here. In terms of employment, there's close to 2,000 people employed in the video game industry in Ontario, with close to $150 million in indirect spend. So it is a pretty pervasive industry across Canada, but Ontario is definitely one of the leading provinces in that.
Great. So definitely a huge industry, but Jason, I'm wondering if you can give some additional perspective in terms of if there's a split between large companies and small companies in Ontario, and perhaps how that compares with other provinces.
Well, nationally, there's a split. It's not split. I mean, 88% of video game companies in Canada. I mean, we look at companies like Mike's and the big Electronic Arts and Ubisofts, but the reality is that about 88% of video game companies in Canada are only small to medium size, so employing less than 50 people. 12% are that 100-person, 50 to 100-person plus. However, what's interesting is that 68% of the employment, close to 70% of all jobs, happen to end up in that 12% of large companies. So there is definitely a divide there, but it helps to kind of balance out the industry. I think there's a lot of people that would agree that having large and small companies in any cluster is key to the growth. So in terms of Ontario, I mean, Mike would probably be more suited to talk about why companies in Ontario are small, because he's been around for 20 years making games and was one of the pioneers here. But I think Ontario just represents such a different type of cluster than what we see in Quebec and in British Columbia, where a lot of the studios are the big multinational publishers, are the big independent video game companies. And in Ontario, for whatever reason, I think maybe because of its age or just because of the way that things evolved, a great deal of the video game companies here are what you would consider to be called indie companies, which are the smaller ones. I mean, I don't know if you want to add to why that is.
Oh yeah, that's correct. Many years ago, right when we were starting, Ubisoft took an anchor in Quebec, and Electronic Arts was a big anchor in British Columbia. And as the video game industry grew from nothing to pretty much mainstream up until the years, which I would say was up until about 2003, those clusters just grew, and there wasn't anything happening anywhere. And I think, that was about 10 years ago then when Digital Extremes first kind of became active in the dialogue with the OMDC. And at that time, there was very little happening in video games in Ontario. And I think through in my view anyways, the attention that the Ontario government has paid to helping incentivize and foster this cluster in Ontario, we're starting to see that now we have, I would say, a disproportionate size of these small to medium-sized companies that have incubated in the last 5 to 10 years, and I think that at least a few of them are on their way to much more greatness. So I would just say from a market perspective that those jurisdictions in BC are just a little bit older and more mature, but we're on our way, and we'll have those, much more of those 2, 3, 500,000 person companies in Ontario in another 5 years, just like they grew in other places in North America.
And that's starting to happen now with the Ubisoft investment and GameLoft and some of the bigger studios that have set up.
Absolutely.
Right.
As you look at the different patterns between the provinces, you see also, what happens when government places different bets. So other jurisdictions have placed bets on attracting global companies looking to create sort of branch plants in Canada to build around. You get those big numbers fast. Ontario's followed a different road, to some extent in film and television as well as gaming, of aiming to have domestically owned companies that own their IP here in Canada, here in Ontario. And you see that in the film and television business, where we have a disproportionate share of production, English-Canadian production companies are centered here, smaller than the studios, but owning the IP. It's a longer-term bet, but arguably maybe a better one.
I would add to that in Ontario, there are a lot of game developers that leverage on the mobile wave, and basically, with lower cost of production, produce game apps. And in fact, Ontario, Toronto especially, is one of the leader, if not the leader, in terms of mobile app development. So I think that, and usually they are smaller studios at the start at least.
Right, and Brian, as you mentioned, it's a different way of the provinces placing their bets, if you would. Maybe you can speak to, on an aggregate level, the financial health of an Ontario producer versus a Quebec producer.
In the film and television business.
In the film and television industry.
Quebec producers have a tool that we don't have. And so the tax credit regimes are comparable. But the Quebec version of the OMDC in Quebec, which is called SODEC, which was, by the way, modeled on the OMDC, or the predecessor of the OMDC, has a couple of tools that we don't have in Ontario yet. And so I was just looking at their website this morning, actually. They've got, in effect, what they call a creative industries bank that is in the business, the agencies in the business of providing some of the services that we turn to the private sector for, which they can do without needing market returns. They've also partnered with some venture capital funds, and they have a couple of investment funds that are in the business of directly investing equity in their companies. And so the result, arguably, is that Quebec-based companies because they have access to these tools, may have stronger balance sheets in some cases, may have better net values, are more bankable, and therefore have a march on companies in the rest of the country because they're more financially stable.
So, sorry, Lucy.
Sorry, can I add the IDM piece of it?
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of IDM, SODEC in Quebec doesn't take care of IDM, not yet. With the change in leadership, they may in the future. But Ontario has something that Quebec doesn't have. Ontario has the IDM fund, which is unique in Canada. And in fact, it's stated by a lot of IDM producers as being a key competitive advantage. The other thing, in terms of tax credit, and Jason would probably talk much better than I about that, but they've changed their tax credit, and Jason, if I'm not wrong, they now consider the fact that a product is evergreen. It doesn't stop after we launch it. It continues to evolve. So Jason, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, but that's a major difference.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a question on this to come, but I mean, it just goes back to the fact that tax credits need to evolve as the industries that they are set up to assist evolve along with them. And one of the things that the Quebec government did quite well was just recently to adapt the tax credit to assist basically perpetually online games that didn't get made and released, that they stayed online, they were consistently and constantly updated, and that work would be eligible to continue. And so it was a very forward-thinking change that's going to really, really impact any company there that's making those types of games.
Right, so maybe we can jump into that
Sure.
question that's coming. It's kind of the biggest hot button issue, I guess, is really, is the government well equipped to pick winners in the industry? And what's the appropriate approach, or where can the provincial government maybe make changes in terms of making sure money is best spent?
I think everybody on this panel is going to have their own individual answer on that, but I'll just kind of go back to what I just said in terms of these tax credits, for the most part, were set up years ago. They were modeled after film because there was no tax credit for video games or digital media. So the government officials that were tasked to convert the film credits to digital media used a lot of the same regulations that applied to film that, quite frankly, don't apply to digital media or to games. And so as we see the industry evolve, not just from the Quebec example, but also here in Ontario as well, there are certain regulations within the tax credit that annoy a lot of people because they don't take into account the way that the industry has grown and the way that the business models have changed. And I just think that, I'll just go back to a lesson. I know that Brian gave some lessons at the beginning when he first joined ACTRA, but when I first kind of got into the video game industry, I had the pleasure to work closely with a founder of one of the biggest multinational video game companies in the world. And his comment to me was, Jason, we set up studios in jurisdictions that create programs that don't get in the way of our business model. That was something that always kind of stuck with me and kind of forms the basis of, when we go and advocate, is that these things, they need to be more Teflon than sticky in terms of the ability to work and function properly for the companies so that they don't get in the way of business. I think in many times companies, in order to qualify for tax credits, are adapting their business model for the tax credit instead of the tax credit adapting to the business model, which should be the way that it happens. And so in any jurisdiction, whether it's Quebec or Ontario or Nova Scotia or BC, tax credits need to evolve as the industry evolves, and those provinces that adapt are probably going to see the most bang. So.
To your question of can governments pick winners, no, they can't, and they don't want to. I mean, the last thing I think any government in this day and age wants is to be actively picking companies that public funds are going into. Because when you pick the winners, that means you also pick the losers, and you get to be accountable for that in question period. And no government wants that. So, the right policy mix, I think, is universal support where appropriate, that rewards successful companies once they're successful, and that if you're looking for active measures like equity investments that are partnered with private sector players who do the due diligence. So one of the things that's interesting about the SODEC funds is that they're partnered with a venture capital fund that is doing the due diligence. The government's not picking the winners. And partnerships with lenders, partnerships with investors, where the government is the playmaker that makes it possible by subordinating their returns, but that doesn't pick the winners and losers, is what works for government.
Right. Ontario has a venture capital fund as well, but it doesn't cover media. Most of the time it's software and technology. So that would be a good idea if they could set aside part of that VC fund for our business. There are two other initiatives in Canada that are interesting to look at. Saskatchewan has just approved equity crowdfunding from small investors that are not accredited. And that's something that the OSC here is looking at in Ontario. So it's not a solution to all, but it's a tool. If we had that in Ontario, small investors could decide to fall in love with a film or TV or a game, and take the risk. The other interesting one that is worth watching is in BC. They have an angel tax credit, which significantly reduces the risk for investors because they get a refundable tax credit for investing in the creative industry and other industries, but the creative industry is part of that program. So there are things like that could be explored. But no doubt, going back to Jason comment, the tax credit, I think, is something that needs to evolve as well as the other program, but the tax credit especially, I would say.
So maybe we can spend some time focusing on what the actual return is. And Brian, this question is for you. Does the Crown get a multiplier effect on their spend on tax credits?
I think they do. I mean, the film and television industry has been spending about as much time as you guys have with many of the same suppliers taking a look at these questions, because government is, looking at all of its spending all across the board in jurisdictions all across Canada. And, the film and television industry posts some big numbers. There's a Nordicity study out there that came out in July 2013 about film and television industry. There's about 260,000 direct and indirect jobs in film and television, 132,000 direct. It's about $20 billion in economic activity across Canada. And so the question is the government getting, is the government activity helping this or hurting it? Is there a real multiplier? And I think the answer is embedded in some of that work. Yes, there is. And furthermore, you don't need to be aggressive in calculating that multiplier to show that there's a net return to the Crown.
Right. So even comparatively speaking, compared to grants or government funding in other industries, is there any comparison that you can make?
Well, I'll put it this way. I guess, it was about 10 years ago now. I was with a delegation that went to Ottawa to go meet with the federal government. And we had a meeting with then Finance Minister Paul Martin. And so we put up at our tent, and we got a big pitch to talk to the federal government about the value of film and television. And we got about 3 minutes into it when he went, whoa, 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 stop. You don't need to sell me on this. Investing in film and television, investing in the arts is some of the best economic development money that government can spend. Right? The net job creation per dollar in the arts in general, and film and television, creative industries in specific, is some of the most efficient that it's possible to spend. You don't need to sell me on that. It's just a question of competing priorities. And I think the numbers bear that out. Compared to some of the, how should we call it, the heroic attempts to save sunset industries across Canada over the last 40 years in many, many sectors, in which billions of dollars have been poured into industries without any net job creation. You just need to look at the numbers we heard out of Interactive, think about the numbers in film and television, and we can point to a live performance as well, and show it's a sunset industry that gets an excellent return.
I'm just going to ask you to just take it away with the Q&A, because we're quite a bit behind schedule.
Okay.
We're just warming up.
Perfect. Okay. So with that, I guess we can open it up to questions from the audience. I think there's some roaming mics. Does anybody have questions? We covered all the ground?
I think somebody's.
Sorry, it's difficult to see. Do you see someone?
We could ask ourselves an interesting question, which is, hey, panel, what's going on with these tax credits in Ontario right now? And that would be an interesting question, because the government of Ontario is taking a tough look at all of these credits right now, and we're all engaged in a detailed discussion with the government of Ontario precisely on the issues we've been talking about. The government of Ontario has got a deep deficit, and the current government has set the goal of reducing it, and is challenging all of its spending. And so these questions you've been asking us today are very on point, because all of us are being challenged at Queen's Park to prove that these investments pay off. And I think, I invite any of you who should be talking to any politicians of any stripe in the next 4 to 5 months to make the case that we've been making, that these are sunrise industries that employ young people, that are green, that are pillars of a new economy, and that the government of Ontario gets a good return from all of these dollars spent. They're asking themselves if that's true right now. The numbers show it. But what we need to do is make sure that they hear it high and low, that this is public money well spent in the future of the economy.
I'm going to make 2 points just before, if there is a question. The first is that we, as part of our study this year, analyzed tax credits in a few different provinces in relation to video games, which comprise something like 90% of most of the claims of the interactive digital media tax credits. And we found that, yes, they indeed do pay for themselves. And so we know that is a fact. And second, I'm just going to make a point as to your comment about grants. Just going back to the actual fundamental structure of a tax credit is, you know, in my opinion, so much better than grants because it is a democratized way of getting assistance into the hands of companies. It provides confidence. And without confidence, you don't have any investment because people are too concerned about what's going to happen at the end of the grant decision process, where it's in the hands of somebody deciding what is the policy around the grants. Tax credits have evolved to be a global model, not just in Canada, the United States, in France, and hopefully soon the United Kingdom is getting their own tax credits as well. They are all modeled after the original Quebec tax credit, which is a democratized version. There's not a lot of successful jurisdictions that have used a grant model simply because it does not involve the confidence that companies would need to make the decisions.
I wouldn't argue with that, but grants are necessary for emerging companies, though, because tax credits, at the end of the day, they're more financeable by medium to large size companies.
Right. But changing the tax credit into a grant would not be...
No, I totally agree, totally agree.
Yeah. No, IDM fund and the way that works, I'm not referring to that, but the format of the main incentive.
Great. What we were talking about earlier, the whole access to capital discussion, and getting to a balance sheet model, right, which can be about angel investors with startups, is a smart next place to go because it imposes some discipline on this process. You're not just cutting checks to hopefuls on a grant model. Everybody lines up, and our job is to get rid of 9 out of 10 of them and to spoon out little bits of money to who our program says is good, and people, in the result, farm the program. Instead, you get to a model where you go, where are the bright entrepreneurs? Where's the best business plan? Where's the best idea? And where can we take some risks? On a more business-like model that builds Ontario, Canadian-owned companies.
Yeah, I would say if the fund is sizable enough and if it's managed with an understanding of the creative industry, that's certainly a path that is worth exploring. I wouldn't drop the grants right now, though. It's a gradual process.
Can we stretch this 5 minutes by just asking ourselves questions?
Great. So thank you all for participating.
What?
There is a question. Do we have time for a question? Yeah. Okay. And the question
I'm in the dark over here.
Yes, we see you.
I'm interested by this idea of funding and tax credits being kind of defined and structured by the success of Sunset Industry and that kind of lagging approach where the definitions of how a small digital business can apply for funding or be eligible for tax credits. What can a small business do, a small digital studio, for example, do to communicate how these definitions are not in line with how our business is trying to operate, particularly when we're trying to establish new business models? Like, who do I talk to? And one follow-up, does that also potentially lend itself to more of a platform-based approach to funding rather than just filling out a bunch of forms?
So your product is a software platform versus...
No, it's a digital content studio, social content studio. So we're producing a lot of branded entertainment, but also working with independent creators, YouTubers, bloggers, and the like. And it just seems that a lot of digital funding may rely on the involvement of a broadcaster, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's not the case with the tax credit. And in fact, that's a very good point because tax credits are about jobs and growth. And beside that, in Canada, we have a whole system to stimulate the television business, which generates some funds for interactive projects, for example, linked to television, but not the tax credits. The tax credits are about interactive digital content production. And the IDM fund is about interactive digital media content without being linked to a television show necessarily. So, and the people you can talk to, for sure Interactive Ontario, but also the OMDC, they are fantastic at guiding people. And by the way, kudos to the OMDC for everything you do for the industry. It's, I keep hearing, how people are grateful to you guys. So thanks a lot.
Great. I think we have another question up here.
Hi. This question is really targeted for, I guess, Michael and Jason. It's regards to the skilled labor force for game development in Canada. I'm just curious to know, is it keeping up with the growth in that industry, or does there need to be more partnerships with academia or mentorship in the industry?
Great question.
From our perspective, especially over the last 10 years, one of the reasons why Canada is one of the top video game producing countries in the world is because of our education programs. From a programming perspective, we've got great universities that pretty much teach the right things and have the flexibility for people who are interested in digital interactive media to start programming and gaining expertise, so that they're almost, they're very useful immediately on graduation. The same with the colleges, typically for art and designers and for sound engineering. Our academic system is I think, one of the biggest strengths. The problem was, as I saw it, that up until about, and it could still be occurring to some extent now, but especially up until about 5 years ago, you'd have basically companies like Microsoft that would come in and literally hire half of the programming class out of the University of Waterloo, or you'd have Walt Disney literally hiring everybody graduating out of Sheridan back in its heyday. So we lost a lot of that. And now companies like ours and other successful companies are repatriating some of that, but we have probably the biggest crisis, and I wouldn't even call it a crisis, would be in the intermediate or senior or that sort of category of skilled labor. So when we need entry level, we know where to go to get it. We just go to the recruitment offices at the local universities. But if we want someone who's highly specialized with 10 or 15 years of network programming in online databases or whatever, that person may have originated in Canada, but we have to expand our search outside of Canada to find them.
And just to clarify, I know, Jason, you probably want to add a little bit, but when, Mike, when you mentioned that Canada is one of the biggest countries in terms of video game production, I believe we're number 3, correct, behind the United States and Japan, which surprised me.
But we're first per capita, and that goes back to the labor issue that we have. I mean, we've grown faster than most other video game industries in the world have ever grown, and it's put a strain on the availability of that intermediate to senior person. And like Mike says, I mean, I think most video game companies would tell you that they can find the junior level employees that come out of the school, but whether you're in the video game industry or you're in paper processing or something, I mean, you can't start a business on new grads. You have to have that intermediate senior level where the knowledge transfer is going through, and that's the big problem right now. And historically, our industry has reached out globally to be able to find those people, but changes to immigration policy and things that have come from the federal level have really impacted our ability to do that. So I know our organization and a number of others spend a great deal of time advocating for why our industry needs to be able to access global talent. One of the things we talk about is we are an export-heavy industry. Yes, sure, we're a global industry from a sales perspective, but we're also a global industry from a production perspective as well. Numbers of the games that you play aren't made in just one studio. They're made in distributed development type spaces where there are multiple studios making the games. But we need to be able to bring in the best and brightest here if we want to see our industry grow. And so, policies that enable that are also good, and they're required to see the industry continue to grow here.
So great question. Hopefully it was answered, and I think that's all the time we have.
Unfortunately, yes. If we want to eat and get on with our speed dating with tech companies, we have to wrap it up. Thank you very much to our moderator and all the panel for bringing some clarity to all that. So it is lunchtime. It's going to be short, and we're going to deliver content during that time. So out the hall, around the corner to the Arcadian Loft for what we're calling our Tech Crunch lunch. It sounds a bit like a Pilates class. Salad is on the tables. Eat it up right away because we're going to start at 1 o'clock or 5 after with some 60-second tech company presentations. I'd like to see you back in this room at 1:40. Thanks very much.